My name's Tony Guiani, I'm Commanding Officer of Naval Base Coronado. Let me just tell you what that means to start off with. Naval Base Coronado is one of the consolidated installations that wrapped up a number of smaller ones. So I am the CO of North Island, where you are today, the Amphib Base down by the Hotel Del, the Silver Strand Training Center, further to the south, Imperial Beach Airfield, out to the east, Warner Springs Remote Training Site, the La Posta Mountain Warfare Training School, Camp Morena, and San Clemente Island. In total, 8 footprints, or 8 former installations wrapped up into one command, 36,000 people, and it's quite a big piece of real estate and stuff to manage. Congratulations on being here for this class. I have not been through this course. You're, I think, the second class to go through. I wish that I had had the opportunity to do what you were about to do. The reason that I was asked to speak today is because almost exactly 1 year ago, Naval Base Coronado was given an emergency to manage. I come from the fighter community, and in the fighter world, whenever we do something, we have a training engagement or an exercise, despite what you see in the movies, we have an agreement that when we get to the debrief part, we're going to tell the truth. Even if it's embarrassing, we're going to tell the truth. Otherwise, we're not going to learn anything from this. So what I thought I would do today is share with you my experiences, and in keeping with the fighter spirit, I'm going to tell you the truth, even when we did things wrong, so that you can hopefully learn from our mistakes. I want to also start out by saying that as we go through this, I want you to know that Naval Base Coronado, which was neither manned, nor trained, nor equipped to undertake the mission it was given, did spectacularly well. So that should never be forgotten. Before I start my story, I want to talk about where we were a year ago in terms of being prepared for this kind of thing. We had an EOC, a fair amount of technology being installed, television screens, phones, computer connectivity, all that kind of stuff. We'd had the basic instruction on what the different stations do and who all the players are and how that all works. And we started to get fairly comfortable with that. And once we did, we began to have exercises. And in these exercises, they followed pretty much the same routine. We'd show up at 0800, we'd get the scenario brief, and then with the scenario brief, we would react and respond to different injections into the scenario. We'd break for lunch around noon, come back at 1300, and by 1400, we had the thing licked. We really never spent any time thinking about whether or not we were actually prepared to handle an emergency. And we were tested in October of this past year. So now I want to tell you my story. It's easier for me to explain this in terms of a story because it keeps events ordered for me. So I hope you'll bear with me. The first week of October of 2007, it's a Sunday night, and kids are in bed, watching TV, just getting ready to go to bed myself, watching the local news, and we're starting to see reports of wildfires. I'm an East Coast guy for the most part. We don't have a whole lot of wildfires out on the East Coast. So I think this is fairly interesting. Well, how about that, wildfires? And they're showing fires in some areas that seem to be kind of far away, but they seem to be getting larger and moving, and that little ticker thing across the bottom of the TV is starting to come up towards the end of the newscast. And on the little ticker thing on the bottom is, in case you are evacuated, these are places that you might want to consider going to. Okay, fairly interesting. Time for bed, because I got to get to work pretty early on Monday mornings. So I go to bed, and by 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm staring at the ceiling. Because I'm thinking about what I saw on the news. Maybe I'm just going to get up and just turn on the news and see what's going on. So out in the living room, careful not to wake the wife, turn the news back on, and boy, things have changed in the 5 hours since I've gone to bed. They've changed a lot. The wildfires have spread rapidly. The emergency services have responded. There's mandatory evacuations going on, and things are looking pretty grim. And I can smell smoke in my house. And I live here on North Island. So I think this is not good. I probably need to go into work. So put the uniform on, go to my office and turn the TV on, and in just that 1 hour, more communities have begun to evacuate. Now, just the day prior, I do a drive-around inspection of the bases, and I had been over to the Amphib base, and I had met my good friend Jim Wink. Now, it's important for you to know that for base COs, the folks who live and work on our base, They don't report to me. I am not their boss. As a base CO, I provide a service to the tenants who live on the bases. So while we may know each other very well, and we like and respect each other and all that other good stuff, we have zero command relationship between each other. I can't order them to do anything, and they can't order me to do anything. So I pick up the phone and I call Captain Jim Wink. He is the commanding officer of ACB-1, a construction battalion, Navy construction battalion. I say, Jim, why are you at your office? And he said, well, Tony, I'm probably there for the same reason you are. I'm watching the news. I said, Jim, you know, you CB guys, you build stuff, right? That's the level of my knowledge. He says, yeah, yes, Tony, we do. I said, well, if I asked you to put together, to build me a refugee camp, how fast could you do it? He said, I can have you tents for 1,000 people by nightfall with water and electricity. I said, great. Can you start building them right now? He said, sure. So now it's about 5:30 in the morning, and his folks are, next slide, please. This is a view from the base at North Island. Next slide. This gentleman right here is Captain Jim Wink, CO of ACB-1. He's just gotten off the phone with me, and he is talking to his folks, and you can see that the tent city is going up in the background. I call Jim back, and I say, Jim, I'm very grateful to your offer, but you know, I'd hate to put you guys out. Can we just kind of roll this back to 500 people? I mean, what's the possibility that more than 500 people could show up at our base saying we need shelter? This is crazy talk. How about just 500? I said, no problem, no problem. So now it's time to stand up the EOC. My emergency manager and I get everybody mustered. Some people aren't showing up. About half the folks aren't there. That's okay, we'll work through this thing. So what have we got to do? Well, we've got a refugee camp going up, capacity 500. They're going to have water, and they'll have electricity in the camp. Phone rings. It's 5:30 in the morning. Phone rings. It's base security. Sir, we have civilians at the front gate asking if we can take them in. What are we supposed to do? I don't know. Let them in. Are you sure you want to do that, Captain? Do you want to ask somebody? I said, I don't think anybody's at work yet. But we can't have these people just stand at the front gate. So yes, you know, let them in. Put them in tents. Okay, who's going to do that? Boy, luckily I have a great Master Chief. So I walk over to him and I say, Master Chief, I need you to go down to NAB and I need you to become the Camp Commandant. I'm just making up titles now. I need you to be the Camp Commandant, establish a staff, and begin to take care of folks. Got it, Skipper. And off he goes. So I'm thinking things are going pretty well. Got the tent camp, got water, got electricity, security knows to let these folks on. Things are going pretty well. EOC stood up. Kind of weird in the EOC. Haven't figured it out yet. But only about half the folks that we expected. You know, we trained with these guys over and over and over again, and here's a real emergency, and only half the guys from the EOC show up. I have no idea why. I'll figure it out very soon, but at this point, I have no clue why. So now we're approaching noontime. I get a report from the camp that we're at 400. In about 6 hours, we went from 0 to 400 people, and it's not even noon. Okay, so that plan for a 500-person maximum camp, that's probably not going to hack it. So quickly, back on the phone with ACB-1, can you build out to 1,000? Sure, no problem, we got it. Okay, great. What's next? Well, I think we've got it suitcased. The only problem is that in the next 3 hours, it's going to go to 800. Wow. Okay, but I've asked for 1,000, so I should be good to go. At this point, I turn to, is there anybody in the EOC who's not doing anything? Chaplain, come with me. Let's go over to the refugee camp down at NAB. The phone rings as we're about to leave. We've just gone through 800, and we cannot build tents fast enough. Okay, what we need to do is we need to create more of our refugee camps. So let's begin to turn the gyms into refugee camps. Why the gyms? Well, again, no training. We said, well, what makes a good candidate for refugee camp? Well, it ought to be unitary, like a single building where we can keep track of everybody. Ought to have toilet facilities, washing facilities, how to have access to other support pieces. The gyms really suggested themselves. Great. Where do we get beds? No idea. No idea. Air Pac. Let's just start asking people. Air Pac, can you help us out? Yes. You may or may not know that Air Pac keeps warehouses full of cots, thousands of them, for when they do Tiger Team cruises. We'd be happy to give you cots. Great. Just need a working party. Okay, Master Chief, dig out a working party. So by the afternoon, my command, those that I can find, are fully engaged, absolutely completely booked. We are doing everything from building tents to sorting out additional refugee camps, which, by the way, we would reach 8 refugee camps on the bases. Beginning to take care of people, processing them, writing down their names, everything else. It's really starting to come along. So now I go down to NAB thinking that when we get to the tent camp, they are going to pick us up and put us on their shoulders and march us around the camp because we're a bunch of heroes because we did so well. Well, let me tell you, the reception was not like that at all. Those people were upset. They were very upset. And we thought that they were going to be so happy. We hadn't expected. We had not anticipated what their needs would be. Again, we're not man-trained or equipped. Many of these folks showed up at our base, at our front gate, with nothing. They had no change of clothes, they had no money, they had no food, nothing. Nothing at all. So we think, from the Navy's perspective, if we provide them tents and water and toilet facilities, they're good to go. Well, I can't tell you how many mothers with babies we had. They had no diapers, they had no formula, they had no pajamas, they had no blankets, they had no clothes. The adults, same thing. They had nothing at all. Nothing. The second thing, of course, was that they were upset that they'd lost their homes. Shouldn't have been a shocker. And the third thing that was most surprising, though, was how upset these people were and why they showed up with nothing. And finally, I just asked, can you tell me, please, why you're showing up at my base with nothing? I mean, we'll take you in, but tell me why you're in this state. The answer shocked me. Most of these folks didn't leave their homes until their houses were literally on fire for 2 reasons. The first is most of them said, we just couldn't believe it was going to happen to us. You see it on TV, but you can't believe it's really going to happen to you. And the second one was, nobody said anything about pets, and we just couldn't leave our dog. Now, some folks did leave their dogs, and those families, the kids in particular, were very upset. Other folks showed up with their dogs just hoping that we'd take them in. So I turned to the public affairs officer and said, you've got to get on TV and on the radio and tell people, don't stay in your homes till the last minute. We will take you in. Well, let me tell you something. By the evening of the first day, we had dogs, cats, chihuahuas, snakes, llamas, alligators, boa constrictors. We had animals that were going to eat other animals. We had animals that could potentially eat us. So now we had to try and sort out this refugee camp into a living area, an animal area, and by the way, you got to keep the animals separate or it's going to get pretty stinky pretty quick. So the animals have to be kept separate from the people. They can't eat each other, and they certainly cannot eat our refugees. So we've got to sort all this out. But it was like Noah's Ark by the end of the first day. Okay, so now what? Well, we've got that piece sorted out. What's next? Well, we've got to help these folks. We've got to get them things like baby food and diapers and bottles and clothes and shoes and everything else. How do I get that? I don't have any of that stuff. I will call my ombudsman, and she can help me with this. So, Master Chief, I need to call the ombudsman, tell her there's a crisis, tell her to call all the wives clubs and see what they can do to help us in this effort. She calls back and says, this is too much pressure, I resign. Okay, what's next? What's your next plan? As fate would have it, there is the National Convention of the U.S. Navy Wives Club in town. As fate would have it, I call this woman and say, I understand you're in town for a convention, but I really need your help. She said, Captain, we got it. The next day, we had truckloads of food, clothing, diapers. I mean, anything you can think of, children's games for crying out loud. Either that they had gotten from Wives Club or they simply went to businesses and said, there's a crisis. We need your help. I have no idea if this is legal or not. Frankly, I was in no position to ask. But what happened was they showed up at the gates and literally dumped this onto tennis courts. Mountains of clothes. Okay, now what? Well, I am completely tapped out. Completely tapped out. I have no more manpower to give out of my command. So I went to these schoolhouses. Marines taking courses down at EWTG PAC. Other sailors who are here for courses, but the courses have been canceled. Can you provide me some manpower to help? Of course. And these folks began to sort through all this stuff. There was a lesson in that single piece right there, but I would not see it until the next day. And that brings me to Tuesday. So Sunday night, go to bed, remember watching TV, all that stuff? That was Monday. At the end of Monday, we have about 850 people in the camps. By the end of Tuesday, we're going to hit 2,000. So, Tuesday is very much like Monday, with one exception. I told you that I got a couple hours of sleep on Sunday night. On Monday night, I really had no sleep at all, and neither did anybody else. By Tuesday, it was the night of the living dead. Everybody was absolutely wiped out. We began to have accidents. Security officers driving off the roads and into the trees, driving into ditches, people keeling over on work details. You know, I'm told by my Army friends that they never have exercises that are longer than 3 days. And the reason is because nobody can stay awake that long. You see, when we had done training, when we had done our emergency management training, we started at 8 o'clock in the morning. We took a break for lunch at 12. We came back at 1400, we were done. So when it came time to manage a real emergency, we never thought about sustainability. We just kept pushing bodies towards projects and objectives without thinking about, you know, what are you going to do when these guys get exhausted? And by the end of Tuesday, we were completely wiped out. So now it was time to go back out to the tenant commands and say, I need your help. This next point is a very key point. I mentioned earlier that if you are on my base, you and I may know each other, but we have zero command relationship. Now, when this thing began, there was a huge food fight amongst the senior officers about who is the supporting command, who has OpCon, TACCon, AdCon, and everything else. But the crisis was going on while they were trying to figure this out. For me, it was handshake con. If you promise to help me, I will be very grateful. Can you do that? Sure. The relationships that we had established between our command, the base, and the tenant commands before this crisis began allowed us to have handshake con. I can't order you to do anything. I have no idea who's got OpCon and TACCon. What I need is a work detail. Can you help? And of course, everybody stepped up to the plate. Now, by the end of day 4, people were standing in lines to take credit for all this good work that had been done. You know, when the messages came out saying you will provide blah, 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 it's already over by that point. But my point is that the time to establish those relationships is before this happens. If you're going to wait for message traffic, you're going to be too late. The problem was that even with this handshake con, I need your help, the other glaring omission or thing that we forgot to do was to include our tenants into our training and our preparedness for these kind of events. So while we had a fair amount of training on who does what and how does it all work, they had nothing. So we had to, exhausted as we were, hold their hands through the next 24 hours to get them up to snuff so that they could be an active participant in this. It was completely unnecessary. So that brings us through Wednesday. By Thursday, this event is going to wind down. And we will have over 3,000 people between Monday morning and Thursday night. More than 3,000 people will have come through the base. This is an example of the tent camp as it just went up. Next slide. The animal theme. Next slide. Some of the Wives Club Marines and other students, see all the supplies that have been dumped. These folks have all volunteered to help us sort this stuff out for the families to use. You notice that this lady over here is wearing a mask. One of the other things that we began to worry about was as the fires got closer and closer, the air quality got worse and worse and worse. There was real potential that we may have had to relocate this refugee camp, which would have been another huge endeavor for us to undertake, which we only did some very hasty planning for, but something else to think about. Next slide. This is one of the gyms. This is the warehouse gym, completely booked solid. Remember, we had a total of 8 of these, each one requiring what we called a camp commander and a supporting staff to take care of all these people. Next slide. To be honest with you, you would think that if you take this number of people and shove them into a very stressful environment, that you'd have a lot of problems, with illegal activity or fights or that kind of thing. We never had any problems at all. Really wonderful. Next slide. This is the last day of the fires. You can see that the haze has begun to lift and the skies are about to clear, indicating that the crisis is almost over. Next slide. And that's it. So that's my experience. As I told you, I would give it to you warts and all. There are lots and lots of lessons learned from this experience. To me, there are 5 that I think about all the time whenever this comes up. They're all based on false assumptions. If you remember nothing from my talk this morning, I hope that you'll give some thought to the 5 faulty assumptions that hurt me when I had to deal with this. And I've written them down so that I can refer to them whenever I think about emergency management and planning for these kinds of things. And again, I'm being honest. I'm not trying to kick anyone in the shin here. The first faulty assumption was that the training we had would be relevant to the scenario we were in. This was absolutely false. The kinds of training that we had up until that point were for the most dangerous, but the least likely kinds of events to happen. Terrorist attacks, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear reactor accidents, these kinds of things. Do we need to train to these? Of course. Are they terrible? Certainly. Are they likely? I would say probably not as likely as having a wildfire in Southern California. Faulty assumption number 1. The second one is that everyone who's trained is available. I told you several times during my story that, we stood up the EOC, we have a very good recall system, and I'd say that less than half the people who had gone through the training and who were leaders and who were supposed to sit at those desks actually showed up. The reason was very simple. About 60% of my workforce is civilian, 40% military. Many of those folks had been evacuated. Under mandatory evacuation, they had left their homes and they had gone to some refugee center out in town or somewhere in Southern California. So they didn't show up. So now I had fairly critical people or positions in my EOC who were not manned at all. So all that training that we had done, limited though it was, had now gone to waste. What we should have done is we should have cycled people through that training rather than making it cumulative, which is what we thought. In other words, if you and I go through this training 5 times, at the end of the 5 cycles, you'll be 5 times better than you were at the beginning. What I would prefer is I had 5 different people at that go through 1 time and have a better understanding of what it is we're about to do. And failing that, having a sort of a cookbook or a checklist or some basic guidance for that position, not that person, but for that position that informs them as to what the heck am I supposed to do if I find myself at that desk. False assumption number 2, everyone trained is available. Number 3, chain of command. In the military, we're very used to having a very clear and concise and established chain of command. And that stuff works extremely well for expeditionary operations. You know that as you cross from one line into another line, you go from one fleet area of responsibility into another and so on. It's all very well laid out. The problem with emergency management is that, in theory, it's well laid out. In terms of the application at the tactical level, that means, in terms of actually doing stuff on the ground, it was not well laid out. I think that you should, of course, want to have that spelled out very clearly for you, but you ought to be prepared to be able to operate if it is not well laid out for you. And the way to do that, I suggest again, is that before this event happens, that you have understood with the other organizations that are on your base who can and is willing to do what. Chain of command. Handshake con, I call it. Number 4. Fallacy number 4. resources are identified and available. I'd go a further step. I'd say that it's a fallacy that you have an appreciation for what kind of resources you're even going to need. Now look, if you've spent your time training to do one of two things, which is shelter in place or evacuate your base, that's the only thing you've trained to, and then suddenly you need to take 3,000 refugees onto your base, I would suggest to you that you have probably not spent enough time considering what resources you're going to need, because the scenario is entirely different. It would be time very well spent to sit and think with your key team members about what kinds of things you would need to do the most likely, not just the most difficult, but the most likely, to identify those resources and then figure out how you would not only get them, but also to distribute them, because that was a big problem. And then fallacy number 5, and the most obvious one, and the one I'm frankly most embarrassed that we couldn't see until it was too late, was exercises are generally between 0800 and 1400, and a real crisis lasts as long as it needs to last until it's resolved. It could go on and probably will go on for days, which means that you need to organize yourselves in such a fashion that you can sustain this effort. It will do you no good at all to have designed, even in extremis, to have designed very quickly an organization and team that will fall asleep or collapse after 48 hours because there's been no relief for it. To do that, you're going to have to go back to those tenant commands and involve them in this effort. And that is one of the common themes throughout this thing, is this is not a base responsibility. It is a U.S. Navy and DOD expressed on the base responsibility to make this happen. Your tenant commands have lots of capabilities, will want to help, but you're going to have to draw them into it earlier.